All right, so now I'm up to page 165, and we bring in Ervin Scott, who's this individual who tells this story, and it goes on for like 4 pages. This Ervin Scott, I never heard of him in my life until this project of Wright's happened. I'd never heard of him before, but I did run across the individual before the book was published, shortly before the book was published. But Ervin Scott tells this whole story, and he uses Ervin Scott for 3.5, 4 pages to indict and convict David Miscavige at 12 years old, just like he indicted and convicted. I showed you he indicted and convicted L. Ron Hubbard at 12 years old. He's doing the same thing with David Miscavige through this person, Ervin Scott, okay? And it all revolves around this accusation that Dave Miscavige got physical with one of his pre-clears, person he was counseling, when he was 12 years old in England in 1972. So, I never gave any weight to that. I heard that rumor going around. And in fact, I think Karen Delacarriere was trying to get me to publish it on my blog. And, based on what? Based on rumor, right? But Ervin Scott, I said, I don't know Ervin Scott from anything, Okay, so in 2012, I'm in Los Angeles, and Karen Delacarriere arranges this dinner for me to go to at Gerhard Waterkamp's house. And it's supposed to be a big event. I said, I don't want to do big events. I just, just come, but we're going to be low key. It's not a big deal. Okay, so I came, right? And so everybody eats dinner, and then they have this big round table. There's like 20 people there, former Scientologists, right? And Ervin Scott gives this talk to tell his story that Larry Wright ultimately publishes 6 months later. And Ervin Scott, one look at the guy and I'm like, this guy thinks he's going to get his 15 minutes of fame. I guess he did. But it was the most incredible story I ever heard. And it was from early on in the story, he starts jabbering about what was going on at St. Hill in 1972. And he said it was being run by messengers, and there was messengers running messages back and forth. There was no such thing as a Commodore's Messenger Org in 1972 in anywhere else but on the Apollo on the ship in the Mediterranean, okay? And then in the Caribbean. It didn't exist at St. Hill. And I sort of just tuned out at that point because the guy was so strained trying to have the self-importance, okay? And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this to Larry Wright before this book got published, that this Ervin, I'm pretty sure that I mentioned this to him. And if I did, if he asked me about it, I certainly did, and I would have, but the Ervin Scott had zero, talk about credibility. It was so apparent the guy was manufacturing the story. It had all manner of internal inconsistencies. And then he publishes the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of credibility. There's no question. This guy's describing things at St. Hill that didn't even freaking exist. And then he tells this whole story about David Miscavige at 12 years old. And Larry Wright just sucks it in like a vacuum and pours it in there. It's an incredible story. And I find it interesting, too, that he uses Karen Delacarriere in here to now all of a sudden she's heard it. That's his corroboration. His corroboration is the woman who's pushing the story is going to corroborate it by saying she heard that rumor 40 years earlier. All of a sudden, she remembers that she heard it 40 years earlier. Man, he just takes cheap shots through here, about talking about, Scott said that David Miscavige took a certain asthma medication because he had asthma at the time, and therefore, this could have a steroidal effect on his psyche, but maybe it didn't, but it could have stunted his, he goes into a whole medical analysis and psychiatric analysis, which he does throughout this book, based on a guy who has no credibility, okay, and based on rumor and innuendo. That's another technique we should add to this list, too, by the way. He takes rumor, innuendo, and then he evaluates it, and that turns it into fact. That evaluation then becomes a cornerstone which he then builds on.